Imagine your life suddenly disrupted by a mysterious and charming neighbor. I'm Rennie Skylar, an ordinary writer until the man downstairs, the Neverett, barged into my world. His deep voice, enigmatic lifestyle, and those irresistible blue eyes plunged me into endless fantasies. But when I mustered the courage to invite him for dinner, things took an unexpected turn. An accidental kiss, a fight for life and death, and a werewolf secret. Yes, you heard it right. My neighbor is not just a mystery, he's a werewolf. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. Join me to uncover Thorne's secrets and explore the true connection between us. Chapter 1. Rennie Skylar needed to stop fantasizing about her downstairs neighbor. She dropped her pen onto the table, barely registering as it rolled off the edge and clattered onto the worn linoleum floor. The half-finished grocery list before her evaporated from her thoughts like morning mist. All she could focus on was the sound of a key turning in a lock, followed by footsteps, and then that deep, velvety voice greeting what she imagined must be a cat. Not that she'd spent an inordinate amount of time pondering the contents of his apartment, or what he did while he was in there. Absolutely not. Ren closed her eyes and ran her fingers through her hair, resting her elbows on the table as she slumped forward, mentally berating herself. Every day followed the same pattern. She functioned as a perfectly normal human being until that car pulled into the shared driveway. But the moment she heard the steady purr of his sleek sedan's engine, all of her cognitive functions abandoned their tasks to fixate on one thing, and one thing only. Or more specifically, enthusiasm, him in various states of undress and compromising positions, all of which involved her. It wasn't exactly conducive to productivity, especially since the Neverett had barely acknowledged her existence during their few chance encounters, when even speaking seemed like an insurmountable challenge. The prospect of a passionate affair seemed about as likely as winning the lottery. Ren pushed back her chair, stood up, and wandered over to the window, gazing out at the fresh eye tracks in the snow-dusted driveway. Thorne's car would be parked next to her salt-stained SUV. As always, in the converted carriage house that now served as a garage, her boxes of belongings sat next to his in the garage's upper level, taunting her with their proximity to him. It seemed her possessions enjoyed more quality time with Thorne than she did. The spacious property offered ample room for two people, almost too much. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilbert, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. She had been hesitant about renting an apartment in such an old house. Despite its undeniable charm, she'd envisioned inadequate heating, electrical and plumbing issues, and naturally, a resident ghost that would inevitably drive her away. But the place had captivated her. From its high ceilings and gleaming wood floors to the large window that overlooked the wide street lined with ancient trees and majestic Victorians similar to this one. The upstairs was hers, mercifully spectre-free, and she adored it. It provided the perfect sanctuary for someone like her, a working writer who thrived on solitude and personal space. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilbert, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Having Thorne downstairs had provided an abundance of inspiration for her already overactive imagination. If she hadn't been so utterly ordinary in every other aspect of her life, she might have been genuinely concerned about her behavior instead of merely uneasy. She'd been attracted to men before. She'd lusted after plenty of them. But this felt different. This didn't feel quite normal. Ren's eyes rose to the sky, and she found herself momentarily diverted. The snow clouds that had hung heavily on the horizon all day had darkened to an ominous slate, grey, and they seemed to be moving in swiftly. They were predicting that the massive nor'easter would start hitting by early evening. She had promised herself she'd get to the grocery store before the snow started falling, just in case. With luck, the power would stay on. Without luck, well, she had crossed that bridge when she came to it. And of course, Thorne had the only working fireplace in the house in his apartment. Ren squared her shoulders and headed back to the table to grab the grocery list. Food first. She'd just figure the rest of it out as she went. And along the way, it would be nice if her mind could focus its energy on something actually productive, instead of creating scenarios with her neighbor that involved firelight and a soundtrack loaded with songs by Enigma. Minutes later, she was headed out the door and down the stairs. Cozy in bulky boots and a heavy coat, she purposely avoided looking at the door to Thorne's apartment. He never came out when she was around. And he was going to, oh God, there he is. The door opened, and well over 6 feet of dark, shaggy, antisocial male walked out. Went stopped short 3 steps from the bottom. So startled she could do nothing but stare. She rarely got this close to him, which was a shame, because up close, he was even more delicious than he was from a distance. Then again, considering the sudden pounding heart and lightheadedness, a little distance might be the healthier thing. She just wanted to climb him like a tree, wrap her legs around him, and bite. Wen's eyes widened in horror at the images that flickered, unbidened, though her mind, biting. What the hell? Thorne froze for a moment, realized he was alone, and they stared at each other in the silence. Wen dragged him in, unable to help herself. He was wearing all blacks and greys, which seemed to be a habit of his black peacoat, grey and black scarf, black pants, all covering a long, lithe form that moved with sensual, effortless grace. His hair was black as a raven's wing, and seemed less to be cut in an actual style than simply overlong. It waved slightly, falling around a face that was a study in hawkish beauty. His cheekbones were high and sharp, a perfect match for his blade of a nose. Probably the wrong word for him, Wen thought. Compelling was probably a better one. Thorne's lips pressed into a thin, hard line as he watched her, his eyes big, thickly lashed, and the blue of the deepest ocean seemed to exert a gravitational pull that she had to struggle to resist. And she would keep struggling, Wen thought as she collected herself as best she could, because she was reasonably certain that Thorne was not thinking please. Hurl yourself at me right this instant, no matter what his eyes looked like. Miss Schuyler, cultured voice making a formal address sound more like a lover's endearment. Mr. Everett, she replied, her lips curving up into a small smile despite herself. He couldn't be much older than she was, early 30s maybe, but H.E.D. never addressed her by her first name. The combination of his British accent and his old-fashioned manners fascinated her. It was like meeting a character from a Jane Austen novel right outside her door. She had certainly pictured him in breeches enough times. Thorne inclined his head and hesitated. Wen imagined he was trying to decide whether to continue outside and risk actual conversation with her, or simply slink back into his apartment and wait for her to leave. Her smile faded in the face of the usual hurt and confusion. She was control, and as far as she knew her conversational skills were just fine. So what was his problem? For about the millionth time, Wen wished she could take this ridiculous attraction, light it on fire, kick the ashes away and move on with her Thorne, free existence. He was probably like this with everyone, she told herself. The man never had company that she had seen, and some people simply didn't like other people. But it got harder all the time not to take his repeated snods personally. They were neighbors. She was low-key, neat, didn't throw wild parties, never be Everett the driveway, and had never reacted to his presence by turning into a slobbering idiot. Despite all that, all she generally had to do was say hello to get him to bolt. So she found herself shut when Thorne shut the door behind him. Everett did, and continued speaking to her of his own volition. And where are you off to before the storm? Miss Schuyler. Somewhere safer, I hope. Chapter 2. Her presence stirred something primal within him, awakening desires he'd long suppressed. The urge to explore every curve of her body with his lips, and even his teeth, was almost overwhelming. This intensity of attraction was unfamiliar and unsettling, as if Renly possessed a unique allure that set her apart from anyone he'd encountered before. Each evening, Thorne found himself drawn to her lingering scent that permeated the old Victorian house. The converted carriage house that now served as their garage seemed to amplify her essence. Mingling with the salt, tinged air from his SUV, he often caught himself imagining what it would be like to immerse himself completely in her presence, to let go of his carefully maintained control. Shaking off these dangerous thoughts, Thorne reminded himself of the reasons behind his solitary lifestyle. His protective instinct warred with his desires, knowing that getting close to anyone could have dire consequences. And just headed to the grocery store. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Rennie said, oblivious to the turmoil in Thorne's mind. I have a few last-minute things to pick up. Nothing more, he replied, his words carrying a weight she couldn't comprehend. While Rennie prepared for a storm with mundane supplies, Thorne was readying himself for a confrontation that had been years in the making. The impending storm seemed to mirror the approaching conflict with his brother, Molokai. Thorne could sense the danger drawing near, knowing that the psychopathic sibling he'd been evading for so long was closing in. The howling wind and blinding snow would provide the perfect backdrop for their final, bloody encounter, a setting that appealed to Molokai's dramatic nature. As they neared the garage, Thorne's strategic mind was already planning, calculating the best way to protect Rennie and end this long-standing threat. He couldn't risk Molokai using her as leverage, couldn't bear the thought of another innocent being punished for owning his affection. The boxes of their belongings, stored side by side in the garage's upper level, seemed to mock him with their proximity, a tangible reminder of how close he'd allowed himself to get to Rennie, despite the looming danger. Thorne drew in a deep breath and opened the front door for Rennie, catching the scent that had slowly been driving him mad for months now, vanilla and apricot. A breath of summer on a blustery winter day. Thanks, Rennie said, a look she gave him bemused. It would be, he supposed. Chivalry was basically dead these days, but old habits died hard, and his were very old indeed, old enough to terrify a beautiful young thing like her. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm, Thorne said, hoping his voice sounded steadier than he felt as he stepped out after her. My first real nor'easter, Rennie said, her tone as warm as it always was when she tried to speak to him. He not sure whether to be excited or worried. She seemed to be both, which didn't surprise him. Their longest encounter to date, shortly after she'd moved in, had involved Rennie chattering happily about the adventure of moving to this small northern town from the sunny Florida coast where she'd been raised. She seemed to carry that sunlight with her. The woman was so damn ably inviting. What puzzled Thorne was why she continued to try and initiate contact with him when he was anything but. He was an unsociable creature who'd spent too long focused on honor, duty, and nothing else. He was under no illusions about his meager appeal to someone like her. Most women seemed to sense his otherness and steered clear. And yet here she was again, fascinated despite himself. Thorne fell into step beside her, letting his eyes rake her from head to toe when she looked away. Rennie's beauty was striking each time he saw her. She had twisted up the loose curls of her honey, blonde hair into a bun, though a few obstinate tendrils had already escaped to frame the perfect oval of her face. Thorne's gaze lingered on the pretty pink rosebud lips, the pert little nose, and the eyes, widened at a resting shade of forest green that quickly returned to him. He already knew the body that was hidden beneath her winter coat was perfect, small-waisted and amply curved in all the right places. Achidi admired it often enough from afar, not to mention imagined it enough in his unoccupied moments. Thorne didn't realize he hadn't responded to her until she tried again, her voice taking on a nervous edge that he knew Achidi caused. Good. She ought to be nervous around him. So do you think it'll be bad? I mean, the weather people seem to think we're going to get dumped on, but they're wrong at least half the time. I think they're right this time, Thorne said. He could feel the approach of the storm deep in his bones, could smell it on the cold breeze. They would indeed get hit. One storm among hundreds Achidi experienced, and one more he would spend without the warmth of his pack to surround him. He let himself wonder, just for a moment, how they were before pushing the thoughts aside. They were safe. According to his last conversation with Edwin, his nephew was doing a good job acting as alpha in his stead. But lately, had begun pressing Thorne to come back. Edwin was increasingly insistent that with Thorne now healed, they could fight off whatever army Morlock could muster. He was almost tempted, until he looked at his scars, and remembered the bodies the friends they'd had to burn. Thorne's guess had been right. His brother hated him even more than he wanted control of the pack. As long as that stayed true, he would stay in this self-imposed exile and keep this the way it always should have stayed. Between the two of them, well, hopefully the power will stay on, Rennie said, drawing his attention back to her. I'm not sure the landlord has a generator to lug over. Even if he could, he frowned. One never knows. Surely you have friends locally who've done this before. She shrugged, flushing a little. I've had some pretty tight deadlines since I've been here. And you know, it's kind of harder to make good friends when you don't work outside your house. Not that I don't have friends, she added hurriedly. They're just mostly not. You know. It hadn't occurred to him until that moment that the woman wouldn't have a backup plan that involved leaving, or that she wouldn't have dozens of friends lined up waiting to help her. Even though he'd ever actually seen any of them, it was a shock to realize they had something in common. But you seem so delicious. Beautiful. Irresistibly, lickable friendly, Thorne finally managed, nearly choking on the word. Now she looked amused. Oh well. You may want to think about visiting your family, Miss Skylar. Or at least getting out of town if you don't want to go that far. There's still time to pack a few things and start driving. It's likely to get very bad. Have you looked at the news? This is nothing like the hurricanes I expect you've seen. When the storm moves out, we could be snowed in for days. And I'd hate to see you caught up in anything that might happen. He silently added, surely Rennie had safer places to go. Places she wouldn't be alone without heat or light. Places where she wouldn't be compelled to ask to share an unfriendly werewolf-fest fireplace. One look in those intelligent green eyes and he knew that was exactly what she expected to do. That, and perhaps more. There was no ignoring the desire he saw simmering just beneath the surface, though the gods knew he'd been trying for months now. This would be so much easier if everything in him didn't want to respond to her need by revealing his own. Thorne swallowed hard. Please call me Ren. And thanks for the advice, but I'm sure I'll manage. You're staying put too. Right. If things get sticky, I'm sure we can figure something out. It was spoken innocently enough, but Thorne found himself suddenly inundated with visions of how it might be if he drizzled honey all over her body and licked it off. Sticky. Indeed. He fought back a shudder, glad he was wearing a coat that covered the hard, throbbing evidence of his thoughts about her. It was time to end this before he did something foolish. Fortunately, they'd arrived at the garage. Thorne opened the side door for her, and she stepped inside. But she startled him by stopping short and turning to look at him, a determined look on her face. He only narrowly avoided crashing into her. As it was, they were less than an inch pressed up against each other and Rennie stood her ground. Pride had him standing his own. Surely he could manage to be so close just this once without tucking his tail between his legs and running. Had always been supremely self-controlled. And yet, with Rennie, and her alone, things had gotten infinitely more difficult all at once. She tipped her head back to look up at him in the dim light, the steam from her breath mingling with his. Thorne could feel her warmth, enticing him to get even closer. She knows I want her. Damn it. She must. I should have stayed away. Is there something wrong? Miss Skylar? He asked softly, and then, when her brows drew together, remembered what she had just instructed him to call her. To our agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. The intimacy of being asked to use her nickname affected him more than he'd expected, much like the woman herself. No, she said, still frowning a little. as though he were a puzzle she was attempting to work out. I wondered if you might want to get dinner sometime. Did you? He murmured, enchanted as much by the way her eyes went soft and hazy as he was by the innocence of the question itself. Before Thorne could think better of it, Hed lifted his hand, tracing the contour of her cheek with the back of his knuckles. She sighed, turning into his touch as he marveled at how very soft her skin was. Thorne's breath caught in his throat. It was just a simple touch, but from the way it affected him, she might as well have pressed her entire body against his. He brushed his fingertips along the path Hed just traced, then across the temptation of her lips, which parted at his touch. Thorne gave a strangled moan when her tongue darted out to flick over his finger before she sucked it into her mouth. Hot, wet, impossibly sweet. Her eyes slipped shut on a soft, breathy sound of pleasure. He hadn't expected it, and the light suction on his sensitive fingertip nearly buckled his legs beneath him. The rush of desire carried with it visions of her using that mouth on him in ways Hed only dreamed of. Licking, sucking, biting, every instinct roared to life, sending heat tracing over his skin. The scent of her, each delicate pull of her lips around his oversensitive flesh, was suddenly overwhelming. The ancient beast that slumbered within him was awakened all at once, and when he groaned again, it sounded like the guttural growl of a wolf. A snippet of a rhyme from his youth drifted through his mind, just an ominous whisper. The mating bond went true and real, is soft as velvet, strong as steel. Thorne didn't know how he found the strength to pull away from her. As it was a clumsy, frightened stumble, but there was nothing to be done for it. He could barely breathe. All he could do was feel, one sensation crashing into another until every inch of his body vibrated with need. All for her. Even in the shadows, he could see Wren's furious blush, bright pink on peaches and cream. She didn't understand, and he didn't have time to explain. "I'm sorry," she stammered, sounding as shaken as he felt. "No, sir. I have to go," Thorne said, hoping his rough voice sounded more human than he thought it did. He fumbled his way into his car, hitting the garage door opener with such force he was worried Hed broken it. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Milburn, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." Long and black and only halfway retracted, punctured his visor as he pulled his hand away. He backed out too quickly, unable to get his breathing under control, or his arousal, which coursed through his blood like wildfire. His final glance at the garage before he sped off showed Wren bracing herself against the side of her car. Head down, Thorne tried to regret touching her. How could he not have realized what she was, when Hed barely been able to get her out of his head all this time? But some part of him had known. It was why Wren kept trying to engage him, why Hed stayed here much longer than any other place Hed hidden in the past 5 years. He needed to stay safe, stay alone. But as he left Wren standing there, all he could think of was the release he knew he would find buried deep within her, tangled in her arms, because no need on earth was stronger than that of a wolf for his mate. Chapter 3. By the time Wren arrived home, snowflakes were dancing in the air, a stark contrast to her tumultuous thoughts. As evening descended, the wind's mournful howl intensified, and the houses across the street vanished behind an impenetrable veil of white, mirroring the fog of confusion in her mind. Wren curled up in her overstuffed armchair by the window, her petite frame swallowed by baggy jeans and a thick cable, knit sweater. Her toes, clad in cozy slipper socks, wiggled nervously as she hugged her knees to her chest. A steaming cup of hot cider sat neglected on the end table beside her, cooling as rapidly as her confidence. Her imagination, usually a source of comfort and creativity, now tormented her with replays of her earlier encounter with Thorne. She berated herself mentally, each self-admonishment more scathing than the last. Thorne's car had been in the driveway when she'd returned, and the mere thought of facing him again made her want to burrow into the deepest snowdrift she could find. That moment of impulsive bravery or perhaps temporary insanity, when she'd asked him out now, seemed like a distant dream. The embarrassment of rejection she could have handled. But things had spiraled so quickly. Thorne had been unexpectedly sweet and concerned, even shy, which had spurred her to seize the moment. But in the garage, with him so tantalizingly close, her body had betrayed her in ways she hadn't thought possible. The memory of sucking his finger made her cheeks burn with mortification. Ren squeezed her eyes shut and let out a soft, strangled sound. Yes, she had actually done that. Perhaps she needed therapy, or medication, or simply a more robust social life to channel her pent-up energy. Until now, she'd been content with her solitary lifestyle, focused on her writing and looming deadline. But this incident had shattered her self-perception, leaving her wondering if she was transforming into some kind of obsessive stalker. With a heavy sigh, Ren sipped her now lukewarm cider. She'd abandoned any hope of productivity for the day, grateful that her deadline was still months away. Now, if only she could rationalize her uncharacteristic behavior and accept that her attractive neighbor must be utterly horrified to be living under the same roof as a creepy, finger-sucking deviant. A fierce gust of wind assaulted the house, causing it to creak and groan in protest. The lights flickered ominously, and Ren held her breath, silently willing the power to remain on. It persisted just long enough for her to exhale in relief. Then, as if mirroring her inner turmoil, the lights abruptly went out, plunging her into darkness. "Damn it," she muttered as the apartment was plunged into darkness. The mug in her hand still steamed, everything around her cozy and warm. It wouldn't be for long. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." If the power stayed out, and she knew it likely would until the storm had passed and the crews could get out to work on the down lines, she hadn't been completely honest with Thorne. There were a handful of people she'd be reasonably comfortable begging a bed from. There was, however, the problem of getting to their houses. Tonight was going to be out of the question. Good thing she had a lot of blankets. Ren groaned softly. She'd moved to Vermont because she'd loved the scenery and wanted an adventure. Along with some fresh inspiration, she'd even wanted the snow. However, might end up being a little more than she'd bargained for. Especially now that she'd hit the self-destruct button on her little fireplace fantasy. She finished the cider, tapped her fingers against the mug, and then got up to light some candles. Maybe she'd get lucky and the power wouldn't be out long. The thundering crash below her startled her so badly she nearly knocked the loaf off the counter. It was followed by a furious bellow that sounded. No, that was stupid, Ren decided as something glass shattered downstairs, and another gust of wind blasted the side of the house. That had either been Thorne, his cat, or a movie, which he was somehow watching without electricity. Laptop. Except that had been awfully loud. So loud. Another thud below her had the walls shaking. Her throat went as dry as the desert. Something was wrong down there. She was in trouble. That single thought was more powerful than a lifetime of accumulated common sense. Ren hurried into the dark and kitchen, grabbed the big knife she'd splurged on one of the times she'd pretended she was going to learn to cook gourmet food, and left the apartment in her sock feet. Years of sneaking up on her older brother had made her expert at moving silently, and she made no sound on the stairs as the blade of the knife glinted dully in the darkness. Doubt tried to creep in, even as her feet kept moving. Did she seriously think she was going to stab someone with this? Rennie Skylar, the girl who spent more time catching and releasing bugs that got into her apartment than squishing them. A low, pained moan rifted up from somewhere behind Thorne's door, and she tightened her grip on the knife. Fear vanished in the face of fury. If she had to use it, Ren thought grimly, she would. The doorknob turned easily in her hand, and the door swung inward. Directly in front of her, a cheery fire crackled and snapped in the fireplace, and there in the middle of the floor, sprawled out face down on a heavy oriental rug, was a man. He was big, blond, And definitely not Thorne. Wren sucked in a breath, looked to her left and right, and saw nothing. The apartment was quiet apart from the fire. There was no sign of struggle, or of blood. There was also no sign of Thorne. But there was something. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilbane, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Coursing through her, pulling her step by step into the apartment. He was here. She knew he was. And the need to find him was overwhelming, even as her common sense screamed at her to turn around and run out into the storm, to find some place warm and safe that was not here. Wren kept putting one foot in front of the other, unable to shake the image of Thorne lying somewhere nearby, hurt and bleeding. Then the door behind her shut with a neat little snick. Wren froze, and a voice behind her, gravelly and yet somehow familiar, spoke. Don't. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilbane, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. There wasn't even time to panic. The blonde stranger was on his feet and rushing at her so quickly that Wren saw nothing but a blur of movement. Then she was flying, shoved out of the way with such force that she landed hard on her backside several feet away. Her knife spun away beneath the couch. Out of reach, she gave a sharp, pained yelp that was immediately drowned out by vicious snarling that filled the entire room. Her eyes widened as she saw Thorne hurl the blonde man to the floor, then leap at him. The blonde rolled out of the way, incredibly fast for the blow he'd just taken. And then somehow, there were no more men, only an enormous pair of wolves, one silver, one jet black, destroying furniture as they clashed in a huge, snarling, snapping mass. Wren was too terrified to doubt what she was seeing. Whether or not her mind had snapped, she knew she needed to get as far away as she could. She had only just begun to propel herself backward, away from the fight, when the silver wolf twisted away from the black and lunged at her again. She screamed, trying to arch away as it snapped its massive jaw shut on the loose fabric of her sweater, then shook its head as if it had just caught a particularly choice bit of prey. There was a terrible ripping sound. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilbane, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. High-pitched yelp, and the attacking wolf was gone again, leaving a gaping hole in her favorite sweater. Wren felt as though she was watching a film in slow motion as she looked up from her ruined clothing. It was surreal, seeing the big black wolf, at least twice the size of a normal wolf, tear the throat out of the one that had tried to hurt her. She tried to breathe in, but only managed a shallow little sip of air. Then another. The urge to run was all but gone, replaced by a hazy disbelief that any of this could actually be happening. Her body tingled from adrenaline, but her mind, her emotions, were numb. When the black wolf raised its head, jaws wet and red, it looked right at her. It took a step toward her, then another, padding slowly across the room, head lowered. It watched her through eyes that glowed faintly, a deep, true blue that was vaguely familiar. But in her shock, she couldn't quite gather her thoughts enough to know why. No was the only word Wren managed to say, and it came out as a quiet, pitiful moan that was barely a word at all. When the wolf continued to approach, the only thing she could do was put her arms up, trying to shield herself. She closed her eyes, beginning to shake, and wondered whether it would kill her quickly, whether it would hurt. She jerked when hands curved around her wrists, gentle but firm, and pulled them away from her face. Then there was only Thorne, crouching down beside her. His blue eyes shimmered faintly with light, not all of it a reflection from the fire, but at least he looked human, and very, very concerned. Wren stared up at him, still rigid with fear. He was the wolf, but that was impossible. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilbane, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Now, Thorne said softly, it's only me. His deep voice held the sort of warmth she had wanted to hear since the first time she had set eyes on him. Not like this. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Not when she could still see how red his lips were from. Rent swallowed hard as her stomach gave a roll. Despite herself, she looked past Thorne to the limp body sprawled out in the middle of the room. It had become a man again, too. A very dead man. Oh my God. Her voice shook just like the rest of her. Oh my God. Rennie. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Look at me. She obeyed him, mainly because she didn't want to look at the dead body anymore. Panic hovered just out of reach, but closing in. Her breathing quickened. You killed him. He didn't give me much of a choice. Thorne was so steady, so calm. He might have been discussing the weather. It was the only thing that kept her from screaming. But he was sent here to kill me. You would have been perfectly happy to spill your blood as part of the bargain. But we're safe now. For the moment. He sighed then. What possessed you to come downstairs with? He stopped himself abruptly, just flexing. You should have stayed up where it was safe. Ren, but you were a wolf. And he was a wolf. It sounded insane to say it out loud. Despite what she knew she had seen. Her obsession with Thorne notwithstanding, she had always been firmly grounded in reality. If she were going to decide to hallucinate something, it wouldn't have been like this. Yes, we were. Thorne interrupted her. His tone firm. I was born a werewolf. A very long time ago. But that doesn't mean I'm not also a man. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. And I would sooner have my own throat torn out than have you hurt. The sentiment, graphic though it was, managed to cut through some of her panic. Thorne's hands were warm against her skin, still curved around her wrists. Deep and soothing, didn't hold the slightest hint of fear. Her racing heartbeat slowed, her breathing evening out. The warmth where the skin touch spread, rippling through her. With it came a measure of calm and sanity. Whatever this was, she didn't want to question it. She needed to be able to think clearly. But, when protested again, but it was softer this time. She couldn't seem to finish the sentence. There were too many things she didn't understand. How was she supposed to know where to begin? Thorne looked at her, then at the body, and then at something over her shoulder where he appeared to sort through the situation. He seemed to come to a decision. Come on and sit on the couch. Thorne instructed her. You'll feel better. Ren stared at him, incredulous. I seriously doubt that. He surprised her with a smile. The first genuine one she'd ever seen from him. It turned his dark, somber face into something beautiful. It was an unexpectedly lovely surprise in the middle of a nightmare. There you are, he said softly. Come on. Up you go. She allowed Thorne to help her to her feet, and found she was reasonably steady as long as she kept her eyes off the dead man. I'm not going to sit in here with a dead body. I'm not, she thought, his grip on her hands tight and all at once. Hell, to my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Close your eyes. She frowned, tilting her head quizzically an instant before he dragged her against his chest and held her tight. There was a roar from somewhere behind him, then a series of cracks and hisses. Ren jerked away, certain that some other terrible thing had entered the apartment and was about to destroy them. She looked beyond Thorne and saw the last few flickering white flames where the corpse had been, leaving nothing that she could see. The remaining ash had evaporated before her eyes. Even the rug was intact, knotty and singed. The scent in the air, faint and rapidly vanishing, was like a blown-out match. Oh was the only word she seemed able to manage. It was more a breath than a word, too. Don't panic, Thorne said quietly. That's how my kind ends. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. It's one of the ways we've stayed hidden. Better that than being trapped in the snow with his carcass. Ren nodded slowly, wondering if she really had snapped. Werewolves. Burning bodies. nearly being eaten. Thorne's eye searched her face. And then he sighed. Tea, I think. For a moment she wondered if she'd heard him wrong. Tim, get comfortable on the couch. I've got the fire, and you're safe here for now. I was expecting my brother, but all I got was a scout. Wherever Moloch is, he isn't close by. Or I would know. So I make tea, and explain, if you're in the mood to hear it. He paused, watching her carefully. She could guess what he saw. I'm not going to hurt you. To my agent extraordinaire, Mylen Noben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. You're in no danger from me. You have my word. Wren watched him warily. How am I supposed to believe that? Even if you're telling the truth. You just said there's another Moloch. Thorne interrupted. My brother. To my agent extraordinaire, Mylen Noben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. He is anything but safe. All I can tell you is that when he is nearby. All his hatred. Wolves of the same pack are like that with one another, especially family members, sensing one another's emotions. It's uncanny, I know, but useful, if you want. To my agent extraordinaire, Mylen Noben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. You can walk upstairs and try to pretend this didn't happen. His voice dropped, softening. I won't come after you. To my agent extraordinaire, Mylen Noben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I swear it. You might be better off that way. To my agent extraordinaire, Mylen Noben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. She considered it, or tried to, but the invisible bonds that seemed to pull her to him every time she was anywhere near him only seemed to tighten. He looked so impossibly sad. All the chilly distance he normally maintained gone, and her heart ached for him, in a way that shouldn't have been possible given how little she knew him. How long have you been running? She could see his surprise at the question, but Thorne didn't hesitate. 5 years. I was badly wounded. Until I healed, running was all I could do. It's kept him busy, and my pack safe. Slowly, Wren nodded, her decision made, though she supposed it had been made long before she'd run down here clutching a kitchen knife. I'll stay for tea. And then maybe she'd walk upstairs and shut the door. Or not. Good, he said solemnly, and held out his hand. She looked at it, suddenly sure that accepting such a simple gesture was actually a very important choice. Then Wren slipped her hands into his, feeling the bright snap of connection between them like a shock. Thorne gave no indication that Hd felt anything, but the echoes of it left her palm tingling. She allowed herself to be led to the large, overstuffed couch. Thorne took care to skirt her around the section of rug where the other werewolf body had been, and Wren was grateful for it. It would be a long time before she got those images out of her head. He could have been killed. Someone had come here and tried to kill him. The fact was slowly sinking in, just like her realization that she'd nearly gotten herself killed with her crazy need to protect him. He hadn't seemed to need the help, and she'd probably done more harm than good in interfering. But because he was Thorne, he hadn't said a word about it. Nor, she expected, would he, shaken, confused, and unable to deny the overwhelming need to stay close to him now that she was here. Wren accepted the fact that she wasn't going anywhere. It was nonsensical, but she wanted to find out exactly what was going on with her neighbor, the werewolf. She stopped in her tracks right in front of the couch, her hand still in his. Unlike earlier, he stopped as well, managing to keep a small amount of distance between them instead of nearly crashing into her. The sudden wariness in his expression surprised her. After all this, what could she possibly do to him? All it did was drive home the fact that they didn't know one another. She knew him even less than she'd thought, and that was saying something. Maybe He'd been lying about who the dead wolf was. Maybe Thorne was the cold-blooded killer, except the second she thought it. Wren knew that was true. He might be a lot of things, but not that. Her certainty about it was so strong that it was actually unsettling. She was just a writer, not a psychic. Yes, he asked when she said nothing. Ren hesitated, trying to find the right words, hoping not to get tongue tied around him the way she occasionally did. I appreciate that. But in the one who came storming in here, you've obviously been keeping to yourself for a reason. If you want me out of here, don't worry about saying so. You don't even know me. And I mean, especially after earlier. God, she hadn't meant to bring that up. She was supposed to be an artist with words. She should have at least managed to say something like, "Look, I know I've been completely with you, and that the finger incident coupled with the botched heroic act probably make your skin crawl when you see me. I should go." He didn't need her in his life any more than she really needed a hunted werewolf in hers. Earlier, he repeated, and then understanding dawned. Ren wanted to sink through the floor. Incredibly, a light flush stained his cheeks. Even Thorne Everett. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Could blush her. Earlier, I have no idea what happened. She rushed out while she still had the nerve. Not like that. I mean, I don't find random attractive men and... Flustered, she tried a different angle. And then tonight, Ivy never chased after anyone with a knife before. I don't know what came over me. She looked at him beseeching lie. Please understand that I'm not a freak. It's what I'm trying to say. I'm not a freak. And I'm sorry your brother is trying to kill you. And don't feel like you have to make me tea. She closed her eyes, wincing. Yuck. I should go. Thorne was completely silent, just for a moment. Then she heard his voice, beautiful and soft now. Stay. Ren opened her eyes to look at him and saw that he was, as always, deadly serious. But there was more there, emotion she could only guess at. It gave her the courage to ask the question that encompassed everything she had longed for and worried about since the first time she had seen him. Everything she didn't understand and desperately wanted anyway. Why? Thorne said nothing for a long moment, watching her with eyes that began to glow faintly again. Ren made no move to back away, determined to get some kind of answer. But he said nothing, instead stepping closer to her, leaving their fingers entwined. Ren drew in a soft, shallow breath. Even now, the hunger she saw in his eyes didn't frighten her. Werewolf. She forced herself to think the word, willing herself to feel the right kind of fear, some modicum of terror. Ren felt safe when there was no reason she should have. Their eyes ever at D. He didn't touch her, but she could feel his nearness like a caress, every inch of her body thrumming with it, waiting for his touch. Ren. A soft sigh filled with so much longing. Then Ren was rising up, melting into him as Thorne lowered his mouth to hers. And all she could think was, yes. Chapter 4. The first caress of Thorne's lips against Ren's was as delicate as a whisper. The second touch lingered a moment longer, though still fleeting. But when their mouths met for the third time, Thorne melted into the kiss with a soft, yawning sound that sent shivers down Ren's spine. Her eyes fluttered closed as his tongue tentatively sought entrance, and she welcomed him with a broken sigh. Ren molded her body to his, tilting her head to deepen the kiss as he explored her mouth. Despite Thorne's wolfish nature, his kiss was far from wild or rough. Ren found herself acutely aware of his restraint, sensing how much he was holding back. This realization ignited a desperate want within her, leaving her trembling and afraid to move lest he withdraw entirely. Thorne's fingers threaded through her hair, while his other hand ghosted down to the small of her back, drawing her closer with the gentlest pressure. It was the most tender kiss Ren had ever experienced, yet its very gentleness was exquisite torture. Thorne's careful touch, as if she were made of porcelain, only intensified her desire. As he continued his unhurried exploration of her lips, Ren felt the urge to dig her nails into his back and drag him to the floor. She shifted against him restlessly, craving more contact, More friction. Heat pooled between her thighs, her body thrumming with the need to feel him inside her. Still, Thorne cradled her as if she were precious, his kisses soft yet thorough. Please, Wren finally gasped between kisses, her fingertips pressing into his back, silently begging for more. When her clee yielded little change, she caught his lower lip between her teeth, applying just enough pressure to capture his attention without drawing blood. Through heavy, lidded eyes, she caught a flash of glowing blue. When he spoke, had dropped to a sexy growl. The sound of it had her breath catching in her throat. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. He warned her. I want you, she whispered, most of her inhibition already stripped away. All of you, for whatever reason. Those were the words that spurred him to action, though not exactly the kind she so desperately wanted. In a flurry of movement, Wren found herself backed against the wall, her wrists spinned at either side of her head. Thorne's face was only inches from her own, and she was stunned to see how haunted he looked, like some tormented prince of darkness. His breathing was uneven, his eyes dark and glittering, and she wanted nothing more than to have him against her again. This is madness, Thorne said roughly, and she could hear the wolf in his voice. It stirred desires in her that she hadn't even known existed. You have no idea what you're asking for. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. What it would mean. I can't do this. If I don't know, then tell me, Wren replied, her jaw tight with frustration. Was he really going to walk away again? Now what am I asking for that you can't do? Thorne groaned, and he crushed his mouth against hers. It was an entirely different kiss than his last one, hard and hot. The rough thrusts of his tongue kept time with his hits, which ground rhythmically into her. He kept her hands pinned to the wall, and Wren's fingers flexed helplessly as Thorne switched from sweet seduction to robber's errand in the blink of an eye. She whimpered softly, widening her legs and sliding one of them up to hook around his hip. Words deserted her, along with rational thought. All she had left was a flood of desire so potent she didn't know quite what to do. The friction between them, even through their clothes, drove her quickly to the edge of orgasm. She had waited too long, wanted him far too much to be able to hold back. The hard ridge of his cock pulsed over and over again between her thighs, until finally Wren urged against him with a harsh cry. Her body bowed with the force of her climax, back arching while her hands stayed pinned against the wall. There was something intensely erotic about being at his mercy this way, and the shockwaves washed over her for longer than she would have imagined, until she could only barely stay upright. Thorne's body quivered, strung tight as a bow, against her as he went still. He closed his eyes, touched his forehead to hers. Was quite the less than it hoped for. He breathed. It would have been funny, but for the torment etched onto his face. You could try again, Wren suggested. She was barely upright from what he'd just done to her, and still she knew they'd only just scratched the surface of what it could be like together. In game, Thorne chuckled, but there wasn't much humor in it. He sounded pained. You have no idea what I want to do to you. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. And we should probably leave it at that before you get a lot more than you bargained for. I'm not human. If that bothered me, I wouldn't still be here. It ought to bother you. He backed away, releasing her, and the few steps he put between them might as well have been miles. He seemed to be struggling to collect himself. It was small consolation when it was all she could do not to melt into a puddle on the floor. Wren let her hands slowly drop back to her sides, and without Thorne's warmth the room seemed chilled despite the fire. Wren wrapped her arms around herself, to ward off both the cooler air and the distance she felt Thorne trying to put between them. After that intense blast of heat, she hated to see him retreat back behind his shield, though a single glance at the straining fabric between his legs told her that it was costing him. He looked away and shook his head as though he was trying to clear it. his shaggy black hair gleaming in the firelight. His smile was as sharp as the blade of a knife, and the bitterness it held surprised her. "Tea," he said. "Though if you prefer to get as far away from me as possible, believe me, I understand." Then, with a flicker of graceful movement, he vanished from the room. Wen leaned back against the wall, trying to catch a breath and figure out what had just happened. After a moment, she managed a few steps back to the couch and sank down onto the comfortable cushions. If she had wanted confirmation that he was just as affected by her as she was by him, she had just had confirmation, Wen thought, but his reaction to it, to everything tonight, just raised more questions than it answered. He was just running from the wolf, his brother hunting him. He was still running from her, and she still wanted to know why. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode of the story, please give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to get notifications for updates.